Good morning and welcome back to the Faces. We've had a little gap, but we're back on the roll now. Aziz and Ashaya back from their travels, and we're kicking things off with the end of Game of Thrones. Last two parts of Valar Rereadis. So hello, in case you've forgotten, I am Sir Berkeley. I'm talking to you from a quite misty, rainy England. It is the time of year. We're going to be getting a lot more of that. Can't wait for my dog walks. And yes, like I say, we've got this one and then one more, and then Game of Thrones is done, so it's all coming to a head. Personally, very busy this week with the good old Castles book, so I'm going to try and get this into a nice compact episode for you, so I won't waste too much time. Let's head straight into what chapters we are looking at today, and it is Catelyn IX, the one with Walder Frey. It's Jon VIII, the one with Longclaw. Daenerys VII, the one where Drogo is quite bad and mean to people again. Tyrion VIII, the Battle of the Green Fork with Shae, and more importantly with Pod. Catelyn X, the Whispering Woods. Daenerys VIII, and two Daenerys today. The one where the Khalasar blows itself up essentially. And finally Arya V, which everyone should already know is the one where we wave goodbye to Ned. So, like I say, I'm going to try and get straight into it today. It'll go quite quickly, as these got through most of my notes anyway, but we have some leftovers, some scraps and scrolls, you might call them. And yeah, let's get into it. So, Catelyn IX, where Catelyn is witness to the crossing, as she's present for the great conundrum that is presented before Robb. Basically, the first real conflict Robb comes into. It's not been too bad so far. Called his banners. Banners came. Go smoke Catelyn. No troubles there. Come a little bit further down, now there's problems because Tywin's on one side of the Green Fork and Riverrunner's on the other, and Robb is on the side of Tywin, obviously not the side he wants to be on. So he needs to get across, and immediately this chapter is showing us Catelyn's worth in Robb's war councils, because remember in her previous chapter there was a question of her returning home, going back to Winterfell, which would have been nice for us and Bran and her as well, but she decided Robb was the one in greater need, and it's hard to argue with her because things could have gone very differently without her in this chapter. Robb needs a lot of different things in his campaign. He needs strong warriors like the Great Jon. He needs the tactical strategy thinking commanders like the Blackfish is absolutely obviously critical for his many victories. But he also needs people with political strengths and critical thinking skills, and someone who can look at things a bit differently. And also he is going into the Riverland, so what better to use someone who grew up there. Now he does put Brynden, who obviously grew up there, to great use, but for that political side he needs Catelyn, because Catelyn was raised by Hoster, as we know from her. We do get a little bit of it in this book, but more in Clash and Storm. Catelyn was raised as the Lady of Riverrun after her mother passed, and because she was so much older than Edmure, so she knows a lot about her bannermen and the political landscape, as we've already seen before when she took Tyrion. So she puts that to good use and already proves she made the right choice in coming along for this ride. So talking of the twins, this whole chapter is basically one big game of Lord of the Crossing, the game that Bran has to play with the two Walders back at Winterfell and Clash. I mean, that game is just the history of the phrase, isn't it? Someone wants to cross, and they can decide whether they let them or not, depending on what they offer. Boom, here we go. Robb wants to cross. Walder says, well, what are you going to give me? And we know how that ends up. And we'll come to Walder in a minute, but we also get a lot of Robb in this chapter. Obviously, that's what Catelyn's for, is showing us about Robb. And let me read this quote to you. So it says, each day he would ask one of his lords to join him, so they might confer as they marched. He honoured every man in turn, showing no favourites, listening as his lord father had listened, weighing the words of one against the other. So that's Catelyn thinking about how Robb's working his men, and we've got almost that exact same quote from Arya. We're thinking about Ned. So this is Robb really putting Ned's tutelage to work here, as we've already seen through Bran's POV back when Robb was at Winterfell. So he's been able to do it at home, going around the lords when it's kind of essentially peacetime. Now he's doing it at wartime as well. he knows what he's doing, essentially. And this whole chapter is a big choice for Robb. He could have chosen very differently if he'd been a bit more selfish. Certainly, if we imagine other characters in his place, we could see different outcomes. But Robb chooses the overall war effort and the eventual goal of saving Ned over his own personal happiness or future life. When Edmure is presented with the choice or the proposition of marrying one of Walder's daughters, he gets quite huffy and thinking about, hang on, which one, and etc, etc. None of that from Robb. He's just, okay, whatever needs doing, let's do it. And considering that Robb is soon to be a king, we can see this kind of a test of his kingliness or worthiness, and he certainly passes that. But let's talk about Walder a bit more, because the first time you read this, I think he kind of comes off as more comical. He's this old little weasel, and he talks in a particularly blunt way, and I don't think even though he's obviously horrible, I don't think you really get the sense of what's about to come. If you didn't know about the Red Wedding before, you're definitely not guessing that, even though when we look back now, we can see plenty of foreshadowing. And I actually like to compare Walder Frey. I think he's an odd mirror to Craster, because they're both men with huge families, and they both take advantage of their specific point in geography to exploit others. And in the end, both have their fates tied to guest right, even though it's kind of an opposite outcome. Walder profits and Craster definitely does not. But they're both pretty damn unpleasant, and there's some incesty vibes, a bit more subtle, a bit more unavoidable when there's as many Freys as there are, but still worthy of comparison, I think. Now, I think Walder, he blatantly lies about trying to send his swords to Edmure. He says about that he couldn't gather them in time and get them to Riverrun. I call BS, and I think it supports the notion that the Red Wedding didn't come about solely because of Robb and Jane. I think Aziz had some opposing thoughts to this on Sunday, but I think he's been looking for this kind of revenge for a while. I don't think he already had, right, I'll get him to promise that he'll marry one of my daughters, and then hopefully something will go wrong, and then I'll murder them all. I don't think he was thinking that, but it was always bubbling under the surface. He's always been angry at the Tullys, and Robb just kind of opens up the avenue for how that can come about. Already at the beginning of this chapter, it starts talking about how untrustworthy and how self-serving it is. So it doesn't just come about because of Robb and Jane. And this is something obviously the show couldn't have got into because there's just not enough time. But there's a whole backlog. He is 90, and he's got nearly a century of thinking that the Tullys are not worthy of his loyalty, and that he gets looked down upon. It's all under the surface, but obviously Robb's, not only who Robb chooses, but how, and etc, etc. That is the spark. True. Speaking of Robb, he's not crowned yet. That's soon to come. But even as heir to Winterfell, he should likely know that he's worth more than a Frey in terms of betrothals. And later on, it's raised about how, if he could have married Marjorie, and then that would have really changed things. That would have really helped out the war effort even more than just this bridge. And there's also more than a few candidates who would have been happy to help kill Lannisters. So, we can't blame him. He does need the bridge, and it obviously ends up in success because he gets across, as we're going to see throughout this episode and next. He gets across and relieves Riverrun. But it's kind of short-term versus long-term. But then again, how is Robb to know that? So, fair enough. I guess he should have at least he could have taken the Frey proposal, but been willing to break it for all the women who could change the war effort. That's the thing. He breaks it for Jane Westerling, who, bless her, doesn't change anything. If he had broken it for Marjorie Tyrell, different thing. But then again, he probably wouldn't have anyway, would he? Because he is Robb. We also get a first reference to Jaina Lannister here, not directly, but it's just a question of sprinkling seeds between Lannister and Frey connections, and does go to show that the Freys will go out of the realm to marry, as well as some subject matter for Titus Lannister, which is going to come back in future books. So finally, for this chapter, I noticed there's multiple references to Freys boiling or Walder being roasted over a spit. I wonder if George was leaving it open that maybe dragons would come, and burning or boiling or roasting would be the end of the phrase, and maybe that is still possible, although most of us think they'll end up in the mouths of wolves. But anyway, on to our second chapter of the day, and it's back to Jon. This is Jon VIII. So if you remember, in his last chapter, Jon killed a dead man, and so this is the fallout for that, and everyone, fairly enough, is quite shaken, and Jeor Mormont is a bit nonplussed at a dead guy trying to kill him, and Jon is a bit nonplussed having to kill said dead man. So it's all a bit, if you thought it was cold at the wall before, it's probably quite cold now, but a bit more an inner chill, maybe. This chapter is about Jon facing, well, not just this chapter, the remaining Jon chapters. I think there's this one and one more next week, and within them, it's Jon facing many choices, and it's about the choices that Jon has to deal with, basically, and we're going to get to in a minute, especially with his conversation with Aemon Targaryen. I think that's quite fitting, given that Ned has just had a single large choice placed in front of him, and Jon has several. And it makes me think of family, duty, honour, the Tully words, and what is their correct order. I think that's a question that's prevalent in this, in Catelyn's chapter, in chapters last week. It really comes up again and again on what it comes again to, what oaths you should obey, like Jaime says, and yeah, basically what order is right. We'll see what Jon's theory on that is soon enough. Now, I do think it's the beginning of a lucky path for Jon to become Lord Commander, because we learn about the fallout from the other, from the Whites and who died. So Jeremy Riker, he died, and he might have been a very popular candidate during the choosing in Storm of Swords if he had survived the ranging, which we can assume he probably would have gone on. But also Smallwood, he dies, and Donald Noy, etc. So not by Jon's own hand, but certainly obstacles to him becoming Lord Commander, they're slowly removed by the Whites and Mance as well. So there you go. It's a bit of, you can call it luckier, I guess. It's not for them, but certainly for Jon, although that's its own burden, I suppose. And Jeor, he starts off talking about the Night's Watch forgetting their true purpose. I don't think we can really blame them, to be fair. They've done pretty well to keep the stories alive. 8,000 years is a pretty long time, if it is indeed 8,000 years. So you get a pass there, Jeor. Not for too much else, but that one, that's okay. So we spoke about the other White and what happened, and it is noted that the other one, Jafer Flowers, he does eventually die again, like proper die, just by being slain by swords. They just chop him to pieces. So that's kind of important to remember, because it doesn't get brought up again too much, and in the show, they make a big deal about needing particular weapons. So it's easy to forget that they can be killed with like just a sword, but you need like a good 10 swords hacking away at it. So I guess that's good news. It's not the best news, but it's better if you're going to try and pull a silver lining out of this. Your swords can do something. It might just cost you a few things. And speaking of similarities to these Whites, so a big deal was made. George notes that Jon pulls on black gloves because his hand is burnt. So now he's got black hands, like the Whites, but also like cold hands. And it also serves as a reminder that he is a crow. He is a black crow for this decision he's about to make in a few chapters' time. So there's kind of a duality there. Jon, he gets two inciting incidents at once. For the most part, the Stark kids' storylines are direct knock-ons from their different reactions to Ned's death in some way. So for Arya, because Ned dies, she gets thrown into having to hide and having to be in the Riverlands for all that stuff. Sansa, because Ned dies, is thrown into the mercy of the Lannisters and becomes their pawn, and that sets off her storyline. Bran, a little less so, because he was already left on his own and had already fallen, but still is a bit of a knock-on from Ned's death. Whereas Jon, he not only gets that, not only does Ned's death set him on a particular path, but this attack from dead men. That is what sets him off on the Adventure North from the Ranging in the next book. So most characters get one, Jon gets two inciting incidents. So it just goes to show how important he is. So in this conversation with Jeor, I think we can pull a few things. I think he's thinking of his family and all the people who could suffer if the dead come south. But he's also thinking that he gave his life for this one purpose, and now he remembers what that true purpose is. It's not just to command the wall, it's to actually repel the dead. and he has to see it fulfilled. He has to think that he's given up his life for something, which I think is the reason why the ranging comes about. And it's Gior seeking out a legacy rather than... He could just sit back and sort the wall out properly and try and man the other castles and basically all the things that Jon tries to do later when he's got a bit of time. But instead, he wants to go out almost with a bang. He wants something to be written. If you think about the Kingsguard and their white book, if the wall had a black book, Gior does not want his to say was in command when the dead came, and that's it. He wants his to say went on a great ranging, found Benjen Stark, defeated the dead, and Mance as well. And as we're going to get into, I'm sure, in months to come with Clash, we see how that mission kind of gets taken by the wayside and he becomes obsessed with Mance instead. But that's his thinking right here, right now. He wants a legacy, he wants a point to having spent half of his life, or at least some of his life, at the wall. And I think that ties back into what we said about Sansa last week. It's worse to sit and wait. It's just worse. Like we just saw, like we'll see with Catelyn in a little bit, where she has to wait for the Whispering Wood. Jill doesn't want to just sit and wait for dead to come. That's horrible, obviously. He wants to go out looking rather than waiting. He wants to go to the dead men. And maybe there's some strategy in that if he does come across them, and maybe he can delay them getting to the wall and save the people south some time. But that is kind of illogical given that no one at the south knows, and the wall is the best defence. He just leads a lot of men to his death. Also on Gior, I wonder if he had been keeping Longclaw back in the hopes that Jorah eventually would join him on the wall and would kind of repent, and then they can have a bonding moment with Gior passing the sword on as it should have been done years before. Because let's not forget, it is his last words he says to Sam: go and get Jorah at the wall, go and make him take the black. So if he'd been hoping for that for a long time, that's pretty interesting that he might have just been keeping Longclaw in the cupboard on the off chance that Jorah would eventually join him. But then, if he's had this near-death experience and he's convinced himself, I've not got time to wait, I should give this away while I've got a chance. Hey, this Jon Snow kid seems pretty cool. Let's give it to him. I think Aziz covered enough about the talk with Aemon, Jon's talk with Aemon, which is a really, really good part of Jon's story in the book overall. And and that mirror thing again. It's Aemon is the other side of the precipice that Jon stands at. He is one side of the answers to the questions that Jon's facing. If Jon's looking down a split in the road about what he's going to do, Aemon is at the end of one of those splits. That is what Jon could become, is what he's looking at. And obviously he doesn't realise how closely tied he is to Aemon, but that will hopefully come in the future. Okay, so the third chapter, Daenerys VII, which kind of opens on the aftermath of this slaughter of the Lazarene and a battle with another Khalasar, and Drogo has been victorious. So good for Dany, kind of very bad for everyone else. So this is a mirror to what's happening in the Riverlands, or what's going to happen. But it's a switch in perspective, because for the most part, our Westerosi POVs are all on the side of the people suffering, minus Tyrion. He's not really on the side of the Riverlanders, but Catelyn obviously is the main one, and later we'll get Arya. So they're going to be seeing things in the Riverlands from a sympathetic point of view, whereas Daenerys is on the other side. She's on the side of the victors, which we don't get too often. Like I said, we have not really been seeing this on page yet for the Riverlands, but we certainly will be in Clash and Storm and going forward, and Feast as well, I suppose, with Brienne. But the perspective is different again for this chapter, because at least in, I think as he's mentioned, like this is basically 3 battles in a row for the Westeros side of things, and so you can add that in here as well. But the perspective is very different, because the battles we see in Westeros, they're at least between 2 armies. The Whispering Wood and the Green Fork, you can strip all the tactics and circumstances away. They are still between 2 armies. They're grand affairs that look and sound cool, and there's drawn up maps and strategy, and both sides know it's kind of what's going on at least. There's nothing like that at all here. There's no... Okay, there is 2 sides, if you want to count the other Khalasar, but for the Lazarene, they didn't know Drogo was coming. I mean, they were already suffering under the other Carl. I can't remember his name now. but they're not fighting back. They're not an army. This is slaughter, not a battle. So if we say the other battles sound and look cool, nothing sounds or looks or cool or even stomachable in this chapter. It's a really sobering chapter. And we got to remember this is like basically a class war. The Dothraki don't even see the Lazarene as true people. They say at one point that they do honor to them. They think they are benefiting these people by slaughtering them because it's the best death that creatures such as these can hope for. So I mean, if you didn't feel bad enough just about the pure slaughter of it, then you can also remember that the Dothraki see the Lazarene basically as advanced animals. And we got to remember they've said before that the Dothraki, they think it is their right to rule over lesser peoples, basically. So you really get into some horrible mentalities beyond the physical here. So Daenerys, she is forced to see the brutalities of war for the first time, really. She's seen some death and some bad things previously, but I don't think anything on this scale. And it's difficult for her to realise what power can actually do. She has to realise that she's played a hand in this. As much as Drogo's calling the shots, he is calling the shots for her benefit, and it's difficult for her to realise what she's done, kind of, and what can happen. I think there's the theme of a sword without a hilt that gets brought up with Mirri Maz Duur pretty soon, and Dalla, Mance's wife, she says it as well about magic and Storm Swords. But I think it applies to people too, just like Drogo. Drogo is pretty much a sword without a hilt because you unleash him and things like this happen, and it's pretty hard to rein him in. And Daenerys, she tries to justify it to herself, saying, "Well, this is the price, etc." And the idea that these lives are being given so that Dany can get her throne, that's tied very strongly to what Mirri Maz Duur promises about lives paying for Drogo in a few chapters' time. So it all still starting to connect. When she's watching these poor Lazarene be killed and raped and everything else, there's a quote where Daenerys says she knew what it felt like. So if she's referring to her early time with Drogo, then this is a very complex and confusing emotional moment for her, because she's got to face someone that she now loves, we can't deny that, once made her feel that way, once made her feel scared and vulnerable and that threat. And I mean, she could be referring to the general feeling with Viserys, because she was always scared with Viserys, but neither are very good for her psyche, to be honest. And aside from the physical violence here, we also have the aspect of taking slavery. Obviously, a huge part in Daenerys' arc, and I guess this is kind of kicking off the beginning of her liberator role, her liberation arc. She wants to be good. She wants to save as many as possible. But again, that's difficult for her, because again, she has to look at her relationship with Drogo and confront the fact that she was once essentially sold to him. Now, she doesn't think that directly in this chapter, but it has to be there somewhere in her subconscious that she was a slave, and that's kind of why watching this feels so bad to her, and why she wants to save as many people as possible. Like you just said, that's why she wants to be a liberator. And it just so happens we get the first mention of Slaver's Bay at the same time. Marine specifically, it's the first mention. So that's a nice tie-in, that's a nice hint to where Daenerys is going to go on the theme of freeing slaves. And we see Daenerys trying to save, and I always struggle with this name, Eroe? I'm going to go with Eroe. I've got no idea, if I'm honest with you. She tries to save Eroe and the other girls by suggesting that they are taken as wives instead, which is admirable, but Daenerys is forgetting the lessons that she's learned here. She can't just force Dothraki to start marrying people and change their ways when this is obviously ingrained as a core pillar in their culture. And even if she's nowhere near that level of authority anyway. So even if she was powerful enough to command that, it's just not that simple. She's learned so much about assimilation, but she's trying to take shortcuts now and trying to solve problems quicker than is possible. Basically, there are no shortcuts between changing a culture and a way of life so quickly. And I mean, that's basically the problem that's going to plague her going forward, isn't it? She's going to find similar set of problems about imprinting different ways on different cultures, mainly in Marine. And to be fair, the protection she tells off of different people when she tries to solve these problems is fleeting anyway, because Airway soon suffers, and Astapor goes back to Cleon, the whatever his name is, the butcher dude. The people she saves, they come under the bloody flux. There's no shortcuts. That's the unfortunate lesson Daenerys has got to learn, that this is complicated, difficult stuff, and nothing can be solved in the click of a finger. I find it really interesting that Dany's arc eventually comes to one of liberation when she is so involved in a major part of the slavery economy here. We learn a lot more later about how the cities of Slavers Bay interact with the Dothraki and how the continent of Westeros basically has this economy. But it's made clear for now in this chapter that the Lazarene, the landmen, aren't a threat. They aren't gaining tactical land. They weren't even in the way for Drogo marching on Westeros or getting some ships. He's come here specifically because the Dothraki, see the landmen as cattle that can be sold to pay for ships. And to be fair, I'm pretty sure Drogo could have ponied up the dough anyway, given all those treasures he got from Illyrio and his general raidings and the toll that Dothraki take at the Vace Dothrak markets. But then why spend that when you can just hop over to Lazarene quickly and destroy people and sell them for some slaves, for some profit? Why not, is the Dothraki thinking. And we've also got to note that Jorah seems to be... he's not an active participant, I suppose, but he's not kicking up a fuss, is he? Because slavery's not new to him either. So with all this violence swirling around, we've got to wonder, is this going to come back for Daenerys in Winds of Winter? We got to remember she's just met Maego at the end of Dance, now Carl Maego, and George has said that he will play an antagonistic role for her in the Winds of Winter. So all the confrontation between Daenerys and certain Dothraki, is that going to come back? Is her gaining of the Dothraki going to be as simple as in the show? No, I do not think it is. Okay, our midway chapter today, Tyrion VIII, I think it is. And big chapter, obviously, because it's our first real big battle on the page, and big intros for Ashaya, and like I said, more importantly, Pod, our favourite. So it's hardly surprising that this is actually the longest chapter in all of the Game of Thrones by my superb calculations. It's a really good chapter for reading a battle. I think George was probably chomping at the bit to get to this and really get some real fighting down on paper, because hey, he likes battles, he's good at them, and the strategy of said battle, it isn't there just for strategy's sake. It isn't there just to be a cool read and satisfy George's good strategy writing. It also is about the people involved. It links directly to whether Tywin is trying to have Tyrion killed, and it just keeps readers invested on a personal level. He could have had Tyrion just reel off this strategic checklist basically and describe the battle bit by bit, but it becomes more interesting to everybody because we don't know if Tyrion is in danger from his own father as well. It just makes it a lot more accessible for the reader. And if we do want to accept for a moment that Tywin was trying to kill Tyrion in this, or at least wasn't bothered if he died, that's so 2 battles Tyrion has fought in. Someone on his own side has tried to kill him. If we think about Mandon Moore in the Blackwater. And it just makes me wonder, because Tyrion, where we left him in Dance of Dragons, is about to fight in a 3rd battle. So is someone on his own side going to try and kill him there? Who knows? Just a good thing to think about. But before we actually get to all of that, let's go back to the beginning of the chapter, because firstly we get a good sign of who Tywin is and his existence on different classes of people. I think that's shown brilliantly with the 2 types of food. There's pork, and I think suckling pork, I think Tyrion says, for the officers, but the general soldiers, they have nothing, essentially. It's Bronn. Bronn has to go out, fish and trout, and that's their dinner. So just a really good example of how Tywin views his army and the different classes within. Now, Tywin, he used reverse psychology on the clansmen, and it worked a treat to get them to fight for him. So he figures he'll try it on Tyrion too, and what do you know, it works pretty much the same. I don't know if Tyrion knows he's being played by his father, or if it even really matters in the long run, because as we're going to see in a minute, he knows what Shay is on some level, but that doesn't stop him. So even if he did know about Tywin kind of manipulating here, probably would have done it anyway. Now again, if we look at Tywin, if we think he's trying to get rid of the clans by putting them in the vanguard and put him in he wants the left to collapse and all that jazz, I wonder if that's because he's either doesn't want to pay them or he wants to weaken Tyrion's position. And we just know this is kind of a Tywin thing. He uses people, and then if they should happen to be extinguished in some way, then all the best for him. And it's just a good mirror, because that's basically exactly what Roose is trying to do on the other side. He's trying to sacrifice certain people to his advantage. So there's a mirror right between these two armies, basically. And again, if we are accepting that Tywin was actively trying to have Tyrion killed, or at least was just putting him in the worst possible position, that's a pretty risky game to be playing at this moment in time, considering Jaime is out in the field, and this is before the Whispering Wood, so Jaime appears safe, and I'm sure Tywin has the utmost confidence in him. But still, accidents happen. Jaime could have just got killed by a random arrow or whatever, and so if that had happened and Tyrion dies, Tywin winds up with essentially 0 heirs, and his big thing is legacy, so that's a bit of a kick in the gonads. And, I mean, we can kind of assume that he's already planning on this point of getting Jaime out of the Kingsguard now that Joffrey gets put on the throne and he controls Joffrey via Cersei. He can do anything he wants, can't he? So we got to think that's already in the back of his mind. So we're going to keep looking at Tywin, because there's just more propaganda from him. He's got the horse, he's got the armor, he talks the talk going around, but when you look at it, and I think Aziz did get to quite a lot of this, none of that really does anything for him as a commander. He does not show himself in a good light as a military commander here. He doesn't brief Tyrion, he doesn't use his personnel properly, and you've got to wonder if this is just overconfidence on his part, because he thinks, oh, my opponent is Robb Stark, the kid who's never fought any battles. He's literally a kid. Or is it just Tywin's reputation has always been overinflated? Like most of what we know of Tywin, maybe it's all talk. Maybe you can just chip them flakes of gold right off, and the beneath is not so shiny. But I do think that him leaving Tyrion out of the plan is a funny reversal again of Edmure being left out of Robb's plans later. So let's switch up to Shay, and there's I lost the quote, but there's a quote about how he feels when he enters Shay for the first time after they are acquainted, and it's about, we're going to get a whole bunch more of this at Clash and Storm, but it's Tyrion knowing on some level that he is buying Shay's love and her physical affection, but also about him being unwilling to ever examine the fact that he straight up believes no one could love him due to that's what he's been told all his life. Basically, he's just had that reinforced by Tywin and Cersei, and well, obviously, so much of this just zeroes right back in on Tysha and the absolute mind melt that is. And I think we can basically see this relationship between him and Shay. It's a real tying from present to past. Something that's happened so far in Tyrion's past is still really present, essentially. We can see Tyrion wants another Tysha, as we're going to find out, which turns out to be fatal for Shay because of what Tyrion wants her to be instead of what she is. And like we say, he knows that. He knows that right now, right at the beginning, first day. He knows what Shay is. He knows she's not Tysha, but that doesn't stop him. And obviously that gets even more convoluted and complex and haunting when Jaime tells Tyrion actually that Tysha wasn't a sex worker at all and actually did generally love him. So and then considering he gets told that, and then what happens with Shay, yeah. That is the beginning of the dark turns for Tyrion, and so we see the roots of that right back here, and his just unwillingness to look at how badly affected he's been by Tysha. Okay, so back to the battle itself then. Let's get past that really dark moment and move on to the much happier subject of horrible battles with hundreds of men dying, and also not just men. It is mentioned Gregor's horse goes down, so not a good book. if you're Gregor Clegane's horse. Not a good book at all. So Tyrion notes he doesn't see any Bolton banners on the field. And so that's kind of giving us a hint that Roose is throwing the game here, which is pretty lucky for Tywin, because if Roose hadn't been quite hard to throw the battle one way, things could have gone really badly for Tywin, considering how badly they already went. So the Lannisters, they eventually win, but I'm doing air quotes here on a podcast. I'm doing air quotes because is it a win, really? It's kind of a hollow victory, like some of Robb's will turn out to be later on. Tywin has beat Roose, or Roose's men anyway, the ones that he sent in, but so what? The war is not done in a scorecard. You can't just say, well, okay, you took this place, but I took this many men, let's compare. Tywin is basically in a worse position overall because Robb has slipped past him and is on his way to Riverrun, and we know what happens, so tactically it's a big loss. And within the battle we get the first chance of Halfman, and it's kind of wildly impressive. Tyrion does so well in the battle, considering his physical limits, his age, and the fact he's probably had zero training. He wasn't trained by the Master at Arms next to Jaime. I don't think that's ever mentioned. Certainly he wasn't any good at it. And he has a nice set of armour back at Castle Rock, but that is probably for show, like most things with the Lannisters. I don't think Tyrion has ever spent much time wearing that or using it, putting it to use. No, definitely not. Anything he does have in his head about battles and skill at arms would be from books. We did open Tyrion's first POV with him reading about siege engines, so maybe he learned a bit of tactics too. But the actual surviving the battle, incredibly impressive. And perhaps that is why much later in Dance, Tyrion remembers the Green Fork better than he remembers the Blackwater, even though obviously the Blackwater is more recent. He remembers the Green Fork, and maybe the Green Fork, and maybe that's because it is his first, and it's just so hard to forget. Okay, so let's shift from one battle to the other, and we're on to Catelyn X now, which is the one with the Whispering Wood, which is one of my favourite battles of the series. I'm sure many of you will agree as well. So, like Aziz got to on Sunday, I think there's a very different perspective. Tyrion is obviously out there involved in the battle. Catelyn has to sit and wait and kind of watch. We don't get the on-screen version of the Whispering Wood, but there are some similarities because Catelyn and Tyrion, they are both lower rung in terms of an army. Tyrion, he does get to take part, but he doesn't get to take part in the actual planning. So at least Catelyn gets that. But then again, Catelyn isn't thinking about herself. She sits on the side and is worried about Robb and the people in the battle. Tyrion, very obviously, is mainly concerned with himself. But we're going to see this role of waiting. Well, we're going to see it in the future. We've already seen it in the past. We saw it with Sansa, where when Ned's men were being killed in the Tower of the Hand, she had to just sit and wait. And we're going to see it again. We'll see it Arianne Martell in Feast of Crows. That's not a battle, fair enough, but she has to just sit and wait. She's made to sit on the sidelines for a bit. And Daenerys, when she's doing her sieges of Slaver's Bay, she has to sit and wait again and wait for news. Yeah, I guess that's just the gender role of Catelyn being made to wait like Sansa, and like she had to when she was a child. She says very often she spent a lot of her childhood just waiting for her father to come back, and I guess that's kind of being mirrored here. But while she waits, she finds a strength in the nature of the Riverlands, and there's some really good physical descriptions of the land itself and how that makes Catelyn feel and how she's drawing strength for that. She's returning home finally, and seeing as home is such a big part of the Stark kids' journey, and obviously Winterfell is made to feel like home for the reader. This is what Catelyn's experiencing now. And saving Riverrun is huge, obviously, but I feel that this is where Robb earns the rule of the Riverlands. This is half the reason he gets made king of this land, as well as the North. This is out in the wild. This is out in the countryside itself. And the Riverlands are so based in their countryside. They've got the most small folk and they live off the land, etc., etc. There's no cities. It's all land and small folk and stuff like that. And he uses the terrain to his advantage, and to his advantage and to Jaime's demise, while making great use of the Blackfish, which is another favourite character of mine, and like we said earlier, a Riverlander. It's also just worth noting quickly here that they do pass back through the Whispering Wood in Storm when they go back to the twins. So at this point in the story, for first-time readers, this is a massive upswing, the outcome of this battle. Jaime is a massive villain still at this point. We haven't got his POV yet. There's no redeeming qualities basically at all. He's just a gobby little shit who last time we saw him, he was ordering the death of Jory and the others. So this is a huge, like, hell yeah moment for the reader who sympathises with the Northern cause, which I assume most do. And it's basically spitting right in Tywin's eye. We've just seen Tywin kind of get his comeuppance in the last chapter, and now the other side of that. It's George at his best. He's setting up all this positive confidence. He's making us say, hey, yeah, brilliant. Really, things are going well for the Starks. And by the end of this little bunch of chapters, it all comes crashing down with Ned's head. And not just an upswing in that regard, but for the actual war campaign as well. Not only have they wiped an enemy out of Jaime's army, but they will gain soon, Riverrun and its men in the process, the River Lords, whilst also cutting Tywin off from the west, cutting down his supply lines. So basically, it's a complete switcheroo from the position prior to the Green Fork. We just said the Lannisters looked like they were in a really, really good position with Riverrun under siege, etc., etc. 2 Lannister armies coming, and nope, Robb is now suddenly on top. And with the aftermath of this, we don't get to see the Battle of the Camps actually on screen, but this happened. I think it literally happens like a day after the Whispering Wood, if I remember correctly. And yeah, like we say, Robb is in a really good position here. And if it hadn't been for Joffrey / Littlefinger being in power at King's Landing at the wrong moment, the war would have been all but won. Alas, ding ding ding, alas alarm. So some extra further notes for the battle then. So Darren Hornwood, he bites it, unfortunately, in this battle, which completes the double whammy for House Hornwood and poor Danella, which is kicking off her storyline. We're going to pick up in Clash, unfortunately. And also, lastly, so Robb, he rides with several members of key northern families, his little version of a Kingsguard. And it just seems similar to Brandon and Ned in their own youth. And to be fair, it's lucky they did form up, given Jaime's really efficient last charge and what would have happened if they hadn't been there. But it also just serves to tie the North together. It ties Karstark together, and even though they come off worse for it, and so on and so forth. Let's move on to Daenerys VIII, our second Daenerys of the day. So this is the one, if you can't remember, that it really all blows up for the Khalasar. Drogo gets taken in the tent, Mary works her evil magics, and everything just goes wrong. Everything, basically. And we get some of the most vivid, disturbing descriptions in the book. The tone is set really early by the physical senses, and everything just feels wrong in this chapter right from the beginning. It's all end of the world type stuff. It says a little bit later on in the chapter that there's a sky without stars, and just makes you feel like, yeah, the world is ending. Something bad is happening, basically, is what George is trying to get across, and he certainly manages that. And so this is basically where Drogo he dies here, really, essentially, doesn't he? Even though he technically lives, which we're going to find out next week. Not really. This is the end of Drogo's life, essentially. And I think with Drogo's death, we can kind of round out the 3 kings that die in Game of Thrones, if you will allow Viserys that title as Beggar King. All 3 of them, they basically brought about their own deaths, their own avoidable deaths through their own hubris and vanity and the need to prove themselves. So Drogo's the latest in that version, because he could have survived, really, if he'd listened to Miri, maybe, or if he'd just had a wound treated properly, or whatever. It was avoidable. And all the Dothraki world building that we've had throughout the book, throughout these chapters, they pay off in this particular chapter, as it did when Viserys died. So we're getting these tent poles in the Dothraki storyline where their world building comes back, and their culture and structure and their chain of command all come back to be shown. And that's exactly what happens here, where Daenerys has to be reminded about the Dothraki following strength and not sons, etc., etc. And although Daenerys has made a huge attempt to become a true Dothraki, much more than Viserys could have ever managed, there's still similarities between her and him coming up against Dothraki custom. Daenerys kept up with her assimilation because it suited her, at least after the initial part of the marriage where she had no power to speak up anyway. But now that it goes directly against her wants, she goes against it. And that's the same thing that happened with Viserys. He was at least happy to he didn't make any efforts to assimilate, but he was happy to go along with it when he thought he was going to get something out of it. When it went against what he wanted, that's when he made the mistake of going right against Dothraki culture, and that's kind of what Daenerys is doing here. So we get the beginning of the life pays for death themes that we're going to see repeated throughout most of the magical storylines. We get a lot of that from Bran. We get definitely a lot from Melisandre, obviously. That's the beginning of that here. And we talked about Daenerys kind of going against Dothraki and maybe making some mistakes. Even Jorah tells her off here for what she's planned to do with Miriam and stuff. And that just shows us how far that she's gone. It's beginning of the connection to Ashaya. A lot of mentions for Ashaya in this chapter. And we're going to get more of that from Quaithe in the future. And also for Jorah, just to mention, he talks about how the Blood Riders, the Coes, they're dangerous because they're dead man walking. So what's the point? They can basically do whatever they want. And that reminds me very heavily of the deserters and the talk of Night's Watch deserters. The man whose life is forfeit is the most dangerous, right back in Bran 1. So talking about how Drogo goes down and the Khalasar is breaking because of it, we got to remember that Daenerys, she loses everything, and the Khalasar, they basically lose everything all because of a single wound. And I wonder if that is George trying to tell us something while Robb is off winning these battles in amazing fashion, that basically anyone can be brought down, and don't believe the hype, basically. So there's a quote here later on about Drogo. It says he was a fire in human skin. So that might be a bit of a hint of where Drogo's body is going to end up in a few chapters. And I won't go too far into the utter chaos at the end of the chapter. Aziz did that for me. But I just think that chaos and that real battle climate, that is basically what the Lazarene just had visited on them in the last Daenerys chapter. So something to think about there. Okay, lastly today is Arya V, the chapter that everyone should know and remember well. Because we'll get straight to the point. This is the chapter where Ned dies. There's some stuff before that, but that's definitely the point of the chapter, and it's the point of the book. It's the whole climax of the book. I don't think it's there's any argument about that, really. Game of Thrones is Ned's book, and he is the main. He's got the most chapters, and his investigation is the main plot, and this is the end of that. This is the end of Ned, which is the spark plug for basically all the other storylines, almost all of them in the coming books. I'm going to talk about Ned's death in a moment. Let's at least go back to the beginning of the chapter, because we do get a lot about Arya at the beginning of the chapter, and especially a lot of hints about the sorts of dangers that Arya's going to face going forward. If you remember, she's been on the streets for a little while now, since she escaped the Red Keep. She's found it's not too easy, and like I said, there's these sort of dangers of theft and sexual assault, and they're all going to come back again to haunt Arya later on. This is her discovery of true poverty and hardship, and if you think right back to Sansa's first chapter, where I used to hang out with Micah on the baggage train and kind of slum it in Sansa's view. That's what she thought of as poverty, and now Arya's discovering what actual poverty, hardship, and all that is. It's a new world entirely. She tells us about the bowls of brown, and we know from Tyrion's later chapters exactly what kinds of things are in those bowls. And the cooking of it sounds absolutely disgusting. It's just like this one vat that it's just always there, and they just chuck things in. It's been going for days or weeks. Ugh. Oh dear, no thank you. And there's also this quote about her. She must have talked wrong or something when she tries to make friends with some of the other orphans and people on the street. Like her accent is obviously giving her away, which it will do later at Harrenhal as well. She gives herself away as highborn. And if you remember, the Lannisters try and play a trick on her at the docks. They dress up some people in Stark clothing in the hopes that Arya will approach and give herself up. I actually forgot about that. It's pretty clever for Cersei or whoever's pulling the strings there. I would have liked to see if that would have worked on Sansa, because in theory, she's supposed to be less street smart, and Arya is supposed to have her wits about her. But I do not think that would have worked on Sansa. I think she's too smart for that. I think if anything, she would have noticed it even quicker, because she knows about who's who and what's what. We really have to thank our lucky stars that Needle wasn't stolen that first night. That's a good bit of luck. And yeah, basically, I just has a real rough time of it, and that is definitely what we're going to get going forward. But onto the crux of the chapter is obviously Ned, and his beheading. So the narrative is that Ned was killed by the politics and the customs of King's Landing, and that he wasn't a match for them. But if you think about it, those are exactly what should have saved him. He should have been kept as a hostage and used, and the customs are that you don't behead someone on the Sept of Baelor, and you don't behead a prisoner who's admitting what he did wrong, and especially when he's still useful. But that's if you don't have Joffrey running the show. And this is really Joffrey's big step onto the national stage. This is really what his opening is. And God, his smile. He's turning to smile at Sansa just before he gives the command. That's got to be one of the most sickening moments of the entire series. It's not quite as bad as Littlefinger claiming Jane Poole earlier on, I think that was last week we talked about that, but it's pretty bloody bad. It's pretty, well, gets you in the gut, doesn't it? Now before that, Ned he swears on the Seven, which he doesn't worship. If he's being technical, he should be swearing on the old gods, because what does a promise on the faith of the Seven mean to Ned, really? It's basically a false declaration. So I wonder if he's trying to hint there, if he had the frame of mind. Let's not forget he's been starved and is feverish and all that. So maybe he's not in his right mind anyway. He's just literally doing what maybe he's literally just saying what he's been told to say. But having said that, even if he was in the frame of mind to try and take a dig and swear on the wrong gods, maybe it's just the fact that bringing up the old gods outside the Sept of Baelor probably wouldn't have made him many extra friends. There's an extra little dig in Ned here that he has to admit that he was trying to kill Joffrey. Obviously he wasn't. But his whole arc is over the top about saving children, and he is literally put in a whole heap of effort to save Joffrey specifically, and put himself in danger trying to save Joffrey and the others. And here he is having to say that he's tried to kill Joffrey. That's just really a big slap in the face, and it makes all of his efforts seem like such a waste. Now let's go through what happens on the stage with all the background players when Joffrey does give the command. So the quote goes, "The High Septon clutched at the king's cape." We don't give our nameless high priest much credit when remembering Ned's death, but whatever his political alignment might have been at this time, having an execution on the holiest, or maybe second holiest if you live in Old Town, the holiest site in the world, you're probably pretty pissed. You do not want that to happen. It's not good. Now, next quote is, "Varys came rushing over, waving his arms." And this is the most public thing Varys ever does. It might be the only pure reaction we ever see from him. Really, it's quite interesting. And of course, Littlefinger doesn't protest at all. Well, Cersei, she does. She tries to stop it, because she's smart enough to know the Lannisters get screwed over by Ned's death. They lose their major bargaining chip. Jaime is in big trouble if this goes down. And perhaps she should have realised that purely talking to Joffrey was not going to reverse his decision. Maybe this is the first time she truly realises what she has on her hands with her son, and it's that sword without a hilt thing. This might be her great realising moment of, oh God, what are we in store for here? And there's an interesting parallel between Cersei and Catelyn, because when Catelyn first meets with Robb previous up at Catelyn, she considers sending him home and telling him off, but realises that she can't because it will affect his future authority as Lord of the North. So maybe Cersei sees something similar here. It is not a good look. It's not a good first look as the new king to have your mum basically renege on your first public decree. If she just outright forbids this, which she does have the power to do, she is regent, she either forgets that in this moment, or she just doesn't think she can make him look so weak, or whatever. But you would think that she would place Jaime's life, which is what is at stake here, above that, but apparently not. If only Ned had have had enough of his mind to go to ask Joffrey to swing ice himself. That would have been a good sight. Do we think Joffrey could even lift ice? I really doubt it. Would have been quite funny. Speaking of ice, there's some stunted secrets going on here. So Ned used ice at the beginning of the book, right back in Bran 1, to kill or to execute Garrett, and that obviously kept Garrett quiet about the secret of the others from what he'd seen above the wall. In this version, at the end of the book, ice is keeping Ned quiet about Jon and Joffrey and their parentage. So those secrets, none of them die, but they are stunted, and they're kept back for a bit. Yeah, there's some thematic resonance there of how ice is both the name of the sword, but is also the quiet, subtle side to the Song of Ice and Fire, in opposition to loud, brash fire. Fire comes with dragons and dragon's breath and cool explosions if you want to watch the show and stuff like that. Whereas the wall, which is made of ice, is where secrets are kept, and where beyond it the biggest mysteries lie. So I just think there's some really neat tying in together of the naming of swords there. And Arya's personal ending is very similar to the Red Wedding again, which was mentioned before. It's left it's left open. We don't know if she's died at the end of this chapter. There is a knife being thrown around. We don't think so, but and certainly Arya doesn't know what's happening. And at the end of the Red Wedding, she takes the flat of an axe in the back of the head. So it's very, very similar. So final note for this chapter and for today: if we want to accept that Littlefinger was a big part of persuading Joffrey to do this, then I see this as the first of Littlefinger's removals of Sansa's protections or Sansa's crutches. Takes away Ned here. Obviously, he is Sansa's biggest protector and pillar of support, etc. So, okay, that's one down. Later on, he knows that Tyrion is going to be taken away when he arranges Joffrey's death. He knows that Tyrion will likely be blamed, and part of that is his arrangement. At that point, Tyrion is Sansa's husband, so that's supposed to be another symbol of protection, person of protection. That's removed. And then a bit later on, he very clearly removes Lysa himself when he shoves her out the moon door. So that's Ned, that's Tyrion, and Lysa, and not that, well, especially Lysa or Tyrion would have been anywhere near the protectors that Ned would have been, but still, they were obstacles, and now Littlefinger has pretty much free reign with Sansa, doesn't he? So he's succeeded there. What a fun note to leave the podcast on today, how Peter manipulates Sansa into his will. Yeah, anyway, so there we have it. Those are our 7 chapters today, and that will wrap up our podcast. It's good to see everyone back. Hope you enjoyed. I'm sorry if it's been a bit rushed, but Castle's book demands a lot of my time at the moment, making a big push on that. And also, me and Lady Buckley are off to Ireland this week, so really trying to get things done quickly. So thanks for stopping by, and do enjoy the trip back across the God's Eye. We will see you next week for the end of Game of Thrones. Yeah, there already. Thanks to Aziz and Ashaya again. I hope they enjoyed their trip. From what I've heard, they certainly did. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. See you next time.